You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Juliet Spare. The story of dead TV star Sir Jimmy Savile's fall from grace has dominated the British press for weeks. Jimmy Savile shot to fame at BBC Radio 1 and in the hit BBC music show Top of the Pops. But it was his hit programme Jim'll Fix It, broadcast in the 60s and 70s, that propelled him on to becoming one of the most famous names on British TV and radio in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. Jim'll Fix It, which was very much family viewing, and children were encouraged to write in for Jim to fix it for them to live out a childhood dream. Sir Jimmy, as he became known after receiving a knighthood from the Queen in 1990 for his charity services, died a year ago, aged 84. Police have now begun a criminal inquiry after the former TV presenter may have sexually abused many people, including young girls, over a 40-year period and sometimes on BBC premises. They are investigating around 400 lines of inquiry, which may involve other offenders. Just under a year after his death, a documentary called The Other Side of Jimmy Savile revealed accounts from victims accusing Sir Jimmy of having sex with underage teenage girls. And it's the timing of this broadcast which continues to keep the story on the front pages. The allegations regarding Savile's conduct came to light following the ITV investigation broadcast on the 3rd of October, nearly 10 months after it had emerged. A similar report on a rival TV channel, the BBC, had dropped their report into allegations of paedophilia and Jimmy Savile. Joining me on The Voice of Russia is Dr. John Bird, Operations Manager at the National Association of People Abused in Childhood. Abby Whittick, a journalist at Media Wales who once interviewed Jimmy Savile in the early 90s. And Ian Dunt, political journalist and editor of politics.co.uk. And Alan Collins, lawyer and partner at Panoni, specialising in compensation for child abuse victims. So what's the real story here? The covering up or the unearthing of a prolific paedophile? Ian, I'll start with you.
The latter. Really, the most important issue that we're dealing with is how rich, successful, especially celebrities in Britain, can get away with evading a level of scrutiny in this country, due mostly to their popularity, to the deference with which they're treated in the media, and to our libel laws. And because of that, they're able to get away with some appalling crimes. And this is what we're looking at now. The timing of the BBC documentary, to me, takes a backseat to any of those issues.
The crux of this story is the unearthing, then, of a paedophile who was able to get away with these crimes. Could you just talk to us about your experience, Dr. Bird?
Well, at the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, we hear very similar stories to the ones that we've been hearing in huge numbers over the past few weeks since the documentary went out. I was abused when I was a child. It was very difficult for me to talk about it at the time. I had a troubled late teens, early 20s. Eventually, now at the age of 54, I've got my life, roughly speaking, on track. I needed support to do that. And we are now hearing from people who've had very similar experiences at the hands of Jimmy Savile. I think Ian's completely right. That is the major part of the story. And the thing about powerful people, they don't just intimidate their employers and media, they also intimidate children, and he targeted vulnerable children, and that scar lasts way, way into adulthood, and that's the mess that's left behind, that people end up feeling somehow they deserved it, or they're not worth being treated as decent human beings with human rights.
So what's next then, Alan, for those who have been victim of abuse?
From experience, victims have lived with the secret of the abuse for years, if not decades. They will have kept the abuse secret from their families, from their spouses. And so they've lived with this. And when a story like this breaks, it creates for them many, many feelings. Sometimes a story such as this has a good side to it, in that it encourages the victims to find the confidence to come out and report what has happened to them as children. And so for them, it is going to be a quest to get that acknowledgement, to be believed, because there's always this concern that they will never be believed. And so this will be a journey for them, a journey where they hope that they'll get a little bit of justice. A little bit of justice is often better than no justice. So for them, I think it's going to be a case of, it happened to me, I want to be acknowledged, and I want that little bit of justice.
Abby, for you as a journalist in the beginning in your early career, what was it like interviewing Jimmy Savile? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just thinking back. It was 89. It was the summer of 1989, and well, he was the first famous person I'd interviewed, so I was slightly nervous, and I was slightly, wondering, would he be friendly? I mean, at that stage, I'd never met a celebrity before, so I was a bit concerned. He was very friendly. He was very helpful. He didn't do anything untoward to me, but the interview was held in public outside a charity event for children with leukemia. It was in public view. I sat down on a wall next to him and interviewed him. He didn't touch me or make any untoward gestures, but I imagine I was 24. I imagine I was a bit old for him. I had no inkling of what he was doing, but when I look back now, I realise that as a teenager a few years previously, me and my friends had all found him really weird and really spooky and creepy when he used to present Top of the Pops, and we'd always, loathed him and wondered what he was doing there. And I kind of look back now and I think, why is it that, we'd clearly as teenagers clocked him as somebody deeply strange, deeply suspicious, odd, he looked odd, he wore odd clothes. No one around him, none of the adults, did nobody. I mean, we obviously didn't articulate why we thought he was weird, but we just sensed almost instinctively that there was something not very nice about him, which we expressed as, oh, he's not cool, he's just a weirdo. But, I had no adults around him suspect anything. I find it almost incredible now to believe that he did this without someone knowing, some collusion, some suspicion. And even if you have that suspicion, why not take it up? We hear from people now saying, oh, I heard this, I heard that, there were rumours. Well, as adults, wasn't it their responsibility to do something about those rumours? There were so many people hearing so many rumours. I find it really disturbing now.
When you interviewed him, though, did those instincts of when you were a teenager watching him on the television not creep in and you sort of view him differently?
Just no, but I was thinking about this now, and obviously it was a while ago, but no, I think I think, oh, maybe I misjudged him because he was being quite helpful and quite friendly. And of course I didn't understand at that point that celebrities would generally be helpful if they've got something to sell, and that really, was, obviously he needed a nice news story about what he was doing with these kids with leukemia in Exeter. But I did actually remember thinking, oh, maybe I was being unfair to him, thinking how weird and odd he was. But, obviously he had a different thing to sell on that day. He was selling to me as a journalist in my 20s, to him far too old. He was selling to me his nice persona as this charity fundraiser. And yeah, I mean, I guess I like everyone around fell for it, but I wasn't deeply involved with him. I wasn't his personal assistant or his chauffeur or a nurse or a doctor or someone who had lots to do with him. I was meeting him, for half an hour on a given day. And I can't say that I had some special antennae that told me what he was doing at all. But I find it odd that people who were more involved with him didn't suspect more, or, whatever, maybe they did suspect and didn't do anything.
Thanks, Abby. That's the point. He was a charity fundraiser and therefore able to use his position as a charity fundraiser to have access to vulnerable people. So we'll go back to you, Ian, because you mentioned at the beginning about this culture of celebrity and entertaining and how people have managed to get away with this. Why was it different, say, in the 70s to now?
It's not different now at all. In fact, exactly the same problems would take place as things stand. What libel does is it introduces a ferocious form of capitalism to a legal process, and that if you are richer, you are able to carry out a libel case, which, I mean, anyone on a modest income would be appalled at the prices involved, especially if you lose, and you've got no guarantee of success at all. And rich people can basically protect themselves. Look, let me tell you, in the typical newsroom, we sit around, and if you're about to write something about someone, the first question you'll get is, how litigious is he? It's not about how true is it. It's about how likely are they to try and sue us back. And oftentimes they're incredibly litigious. As far as I understand it, he was one example of them. So nothing's improved in that respect at all. And the British attitude towards its national treasures can often try to just create a firewall around any criticism. So in a completely different capacity, look at the way that any woman who's married a former Beatle gets treated, with a savagery and with a sort of protectiveness around the Beatle. Or if we stretch it out to a more serious territory, let's take John Peel, who was a radio DJ when I was growing up. He was my introduction to music, really, to a mature form of music. And for about 3 generations of Brits, we grew up listening to John Peel in the evenings. He introduced us to music. We thought about him very warmly. Now, as part of the Savile thing coming out, we're finding out that he actually impregnated a 15-year-old girl. Very early on, I think it was in the 60s, it might have even been in the 50s. So this firewall that we create around our national treasures, around people who are held up as being above criticism because they're so well loved, is very damaging to us, and it takes place on a cultural level and it takes place on a legal level.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Juliet Spare. I'm joined by Dr. John Bird, Operations Manager at NAPAC, the National Association of People Abused in Childhood, Ian Dunt, Political Editor of politics.co.uk, Abby Whittick, journalist from Media Wales, and lawyer and partner at Pannoni, Alan Collins.
The risk is that if lessons are not learned from Savile, that children will still be at risk, because there is still this sort of taboo when it comes to child abuse. There have been improvements over the years, there's more recognition, but it's still a very sensitive subject, understandably so, but it's still a subject that people shy away from. And Savile, I think, is exposing that, because what we've been hearing about is that former colleagues of Savile apparently were aware of rumours and stories, however you want to put it. So there's this picture emerging that things were known about Jimmy Savile, and that begs the question why all of this has come to fruition today when it should have come to the attention of authorities years, if not decades ago. So I'm hoping that this debate that is now taking place here and across, the media will force not just BBC but all institutions that make up the establishment to address the fact that child abuse happens and that celebrity status is an enabler for people who want to do harm. Then, if those institutions and society are prepared to face up to that, then some good may actually come out of all the misery and tragedy that we've been hearing about. That is the general picture, okay? For newspapers or other organs of the media to report stories, for that to happen, as a society, we need to be able to embrace the risks and facts of child abuse, okay? Otherwise, we will simply not make progress, and the tragedies will carry on occurring.
Well, I'd like to come to you now, John. Do you think the coverage that the media has done over Jimmy Savile helps in any way his victims? I mean, is there any closure for them? Because he's dead, so they're never going to sort of see anyone sort of pay a price for the abuse they've done.
It is very difficult to speak of closure in child abuse generally. And as Alan has pointed out, it's not really about the money, the compensation, the legal procedures. That's about a public recognition that something horrendous was done that should never be done to any child. I suppose people have been given permission. They've been given a clear indication that if they speak about what happened decades ago, they will be believed. And for a long time, because of all of the things that Alan has mentioned, it is difficult to talk about this topic. Generally in society, people don't want to know about it. And it's a little bit too much. It's a raw nerve, I think, for everybody to think about children being abused. And this, it's all about power, really. I think that's what it comes back to, the power that Jimmy Savile had over the media. And I think we're looking at it perhaps the wrong way round, thinking that it was celebrity that enabled him to abuse children. He was an abuser of children, and he deliberately put himself in a position where he had power in hospitals and within the BBC so that he could carry on abusing children. That was his motivation. People should have been aware of the dangers where there are young children around, even though at the time there was a different culture. That's no excuse. Things have got much better with the Sexual Offences Act 2003, for example, with DNA evidence, but still, ultimately, a rape, be it between an adult or an adult and a child, is very, very hard to prove because only two people were there in most cases. And if the DNA evidence is destroyed, it's one person's word against another. But now we are hearing those words spoken firsthand, perhaps for the first time in decades. Many of the people we're hearing from are in their 60s and 70s, have never spoken to a soul about it before in their lives. And that's that's the start of a process. It's not anywhere near closure. Some of the people won't be able to speak to the police for some time. This is the beginning of a healing journey. And you'll never be able to change history and wake up one day and be a person who wasn't raped when they were a child, if that's what happened to you in childhood. But you can find constructive ways to live with it if you're prepared to work hard at it, and it's very hard work.
And so this public recognition of what's happened, do you think that perhaps child abuse was more tolerated in the 70s?
A blind eye was turned, I think. I think people, any right-minded person would, their guts would turn at these details. But they were either intimidated by Jimmy Savile himself or by the power that his money bought him legally, or they were in need of the money that he was prepared to raise for various charitable institutions, hospitals particularly, and that meant that the people who controlled those institutions felt they were obliged to give him access and perhaps look the other way. Although some of them, it seems, we're now hearing, didn't look the other way. They actually procured children for Savile to abuse.
Just interested in this idea that this was a long time ago, things were different, culture was different. I think there's a danger in that because, there have been quite high-profile child abuse cases up in the north of England in the last couple of years and things like this. I think the danger is that we ignore this and say, things were different then. And I think maybe the powers that be that are involved in this, hospitals and broadcasters, have to actually make clear how they actually can protect. Obviously, we can't guarantee total protection, but how they can protect against something similar to this happening again, and who's responsible for what and who's answerable, so that people can't hide behind this facade of, I heard rumours, but, I wasn't sure, so I didn't say. I think there should be, some action should be taken to show that they are taking measures to make sure things like this don't happen again, because there are still celebrities raising money. The child line was advertised last night on television. There's still famous people raising money for children, not just here, but in the third world as well. And I wonder what safeguards there are in place to make sure they're not, tomorrow's Jimmy Saviles.
Ian?
That's undoubtedly true. But for us to have that cultural change, for us to look at how we can make institutions in the media and charities more open to unearthing this stuff, we need to get away from the current narrative, which is really about, this is the BBC, it's just about the BBC, let's get the BBC. And this happens because there is this pre-built army of BBC attackers, mostly from their commercial competitors in the privately held media, who will just launch on anything. When Russell Brand made an ill-advised phone call, they ran off it for about 3 weeks. Now, this is obviously 10 times as severe, 100 times more severe than that, so we can only imagine how much damage they try to do. But actually, that's a deeply irresponsible way to approach what's going on right now, because it drags it down to us having a debate about the date that a Newsnight investigation was on. Now, yes, that does matter. It is important. But it is not more important than addressing the culture around how these events take place. And because of the hatred of the BBC and the privately held media, that's unfortunately where the debate is heading.
I think that's really true.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Juliet Spare, and I'm joined by Dr. John Bird, the Operations Manager at NAPAC, the National Association of People Abused in Childhood, Ian Dunt, Political Editor of politics.co.uk, Abby Whittick from Media Wales, and lawyer Alan Collins. I want to discuss the other aspects of this story, and I agree with you. A date of a broadcast or not broadcast, the fact that a journalist wanted to unearth it is brilliant. And that has led to all of this. And if any way some good can come for this for any other victims of child abuse, then I hope that some will. And I think you, John, have said that it might have been a blind eye then, but actually this is scratching the surface. This is only just the beginning for victims to come to terms with this. And I think it's incredibly brave for you, who has suffered yourself and is a survivor. I think your voice is incredibly important.
It is the voice of survivors that needs to be listened to absolutely at the heart of any investigation in whichever institution that needs to be looked at. They're the only people who really knew what happened in these one-on-one incidents of abuse by Jimmy Savile against children. It's those people who were children then and who are adults now who really know exactly what happened and how he went about doing it and how he kept everybody quiet afterwards. So the survivors' organisations, people who were abused in childhood, NSPCC estimates put the figure at, roughly speaking, 1 in 4. Council of Europe says 1 in 5 across Europe experience some kind of childhood sexual abuse. The vast majority of those go on to recover if they've got nurturing family homes, if it's an isolated incident, if the perpetrator is taken away and the parents or carers make sure they never see them again. But the people who are targeted by Jimmy Savile and other perpetrators of this kind of abuse, quite deliberately, are vulnerable children in some way, people who don't necessarily have that nurturing home, and therefore are never really able to speak about it until something like this comes along and they're given clear permission and a clear indication that they will be taken seriously rather than brushed aside and perhaps even ridiculed, as they probably were in the past when they tried to tell as children. And that's unfortunately too often still the case. There are still vulnerable children in our society who are targeted by perpetrators of childhood abuse. It's still going on.
What's your experience of having to deal with the stories of vulnerable children who have been abused and convincing them that there is a process that they can go down and there will be at some point some sort of recompense for what they've been through?
Don't want to generalise, but by and large, victims tell me that when they start the process, it's very daunting for them and they wonder, naturally, what have I got myself involved in? But at the end, they've been able to say, I can draw a line in the sand and move on. Like we've been hearing, recovery, complete recovery is probably in most cases very difficult, if not impossible. But for a victim, from what they tell me, they can draw a line in the sand and move on because they've got that recognition, which they've missed out on for the majority of their lives, not being believed, and so on. And they, I can get messages saying, "Thank you for believing me," or "Thank you." Those words mean everything because you realise that actually you've achieved what the victim wanted.
Would you agree, John? Is that actually just someone believing you? And this strikes me as that, if there's 400 lines of inquiry, a lot of people didn't believe a lot of people who had a problem with a certain celebrity. And
absolutely true, yeah. And it's the number of calls that we've answered on our support line. We normally take about 80 to 100 a week. We've done well over 200 in each of the 2 weeks, full 2 weeks since the documentary went out. The vast majority are nothing to do with Jimmy Savile or his associates. We've heard quite a lot about Jimmy Savile, perhaps 30 different either witness statements or what the police would call victim statements. We call them survivors. But the vast majority of our calls are people who have been triggered because they were abused perhaps in the 70s or a similar time, but nothing to do with Jimmy Savile. And there was an awful lot of this going on, and perhaps they did try and tell in the past and were not believed. And now, there's a charity with a national helpline number where people can ring up and be taken seriously. We can't bring a case on their behalf. All we can do is, recommend that they contact the police, and that might turn into a court case if the Crown Prosecution Service thinks that there's a strong enough case, and then there'll be a case in court, and they might get some recognition. But there's still no guarantee of that, and I think the fear that Alan is talking about that survivors first come to him with is the fear that there's no guarantee at the end of it that it is very hard work, and that they're likely to be challenged in court by very well-paid defence lawyers who are going to try and ridicule their evidence. And that's, again, another humiliation that survivors have to go through, which is very, very frightening, which is why we don't recommend people go through that until they're pretty resilient and tough and come to terms with the emotional realities of their current life and their childhood experience before they go into that.
If you don't mind, John, you mentioned you're 54.
Mm-hmm.
How old were you when you were abused?
I was raped by a complete stranger when I was 4 3/4 years old, playing on my own in a local park. Paid me to go into the woods with him and raped me. That was a one-off isolated incident. I ran home, told my mum all about it. She believed me, couldn't not believe me because there was physical evidence, but told me to try and forget about it. Then at the age of 8, I was sent to a boarding school that was run by a very, very sadistic abuser of children, sexual, physical abuse. He got found out and stopped when I was age 10, but, in those days there was no sort of services for children or, child psychiatry or any of that kind of stuff.
You mentioned at the beginning you're 54 and only just getting your life back on track.
Mm.
So it just strikes me that there's a long road ahead for the enormous amount of victims from this one person. This is just the beginning of it, and we are in danger of ignoring it. The British media are in danger of ignoring the real issue here and focusing on spats and emails.
Also, one has to be realistic, as I think that both the gentlemen here are being, about the process by which you go through as a victim of abuse. Our legal system, you have exactly the same problems with child abuse as you do really with rape later on. Our legal system, the standards and the principles upon which it is based, finds it very hard to deal with instances like this, partly because, as you mentioned earlier, it's the he said, she said, there's usually an absence of physical evidence. And for the burden of proof, that's quite a difficult thing to show. And secondly, again, as you mentioned earlier, because of the cross-examination in court, which is often referred to as a second rape and having to relive the experience again. And we've struggled as a society with how we deal with that. I mean, on the one hand, there's arguments for do we pull down the standards for proof in rape cases and child abuse? Or do we have to accept this quite low level of prosecution? And we have to always be honest, I think, with people that, this is a difficult area to get justice and to get recompense in that way. And we just have to sort of accept that fact as it is, as a very deeply unfortunate consequence of our legal system, which we must maintain for rather obvious reasons.
Just one thing that I think that often children don't say things when something really terrible has happened, and they don't speak and they won't say things, and that maybe those sort of in positions of power and charities and broadcasters and whatever who work with them need to perhaps be, more aware of just how children communicate. I don't know how you could add that in some way, but that's something quite disturbing. Obviously, children are used quite a lot in the media and on children's programs and broadcasting generally, and in charities to fundraise. And it would be nice to know that the people working with them perhaps have more idea of how children operate.
Around the world, there's going to be all sorts of people who will be hearing this kind of a story, and if they want the support, they can look on our website, www.napac.org.uk, and there's an awful lot of helpful resources for helping you on your healing journey on that site.
I'd like to thank all my guests: John Bird, the operations manager at NAPAC, Alan Collins, partner at Panoni, Ian Dunt, political editor of politics.co.uk, and Abby Whittock, journalist from Media Wales. Thanks very much.
Their employers and media, they also intimidate children, and he targeted vulnerable children, and that scar lasts way, way into adulthood, and that's the mess that's left behind, that people end up feeling somehow they deserved it, or they're not worth being treated as decent human beings with human rights.
So what's next then, Alan, for those who have been victim of abuse?
From experience, victims have lived with the secret of the abuse for years, if not decades. They will have kept the abuse secret from their families, from their spouses. And so they've lived with this. And when a story like this breaks, it creates for them many, many feelings. Sometimes a story such as this has a good side to it in that it
some appalling crimes, and this is what we're looking at now. The timing of a BBC documentary, to me, takes a backseat to any of those issues.
The crux of this story is the unearthing then of a paedophile who was able to get away with these crimes. Could you just talk to us about your experience, Dr. Bird?
Well, at the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, we hear very similar stories to the ones that we've been hearing in huge numbers over the past few weeks since the documentary went out. I was abused when I was a child. It was very difficult for me to talk about it at the time. I had a troubled late teens, early 20s. Eventually, now at the age of 54, I've got my life, roughly speaking, on track. I needed support to do that. And we're now hearing from people who've had very similar experiences at the hands of Jimmy Savile. I think Ian's completely right. That is the major part of the story. And the thing about powerful people, they don't just intimidate.
Police have now begun a criminal inquiry after the former TV presenter may have sexually abused many people, including young girls, over a 40-year period and sometimes on BBC premises. They are investigating around 400 lines of inquiry, which may involve other offenders. Just under a year after his death, a documentary called The Other Side of Jimmy Savile revealed accounts from victims accusing Sir Jimmy of having sex with underage teenage girls. And it's the timing of this broadcast which continues to keep the story on the front pages. The allegations regarding Savile's conduct came to light following the ITV investigation broadcast on the 3rd of October, nearly 10 months after it had emerged. A similar report on a rival TV channel, the BBC, had dropped their report into allegations of paedophilia and Jimmy. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Juliet Spare. Of dead TV star Sir Jimmy Savile's fall from grace has dominated the British press for weeks. Jimmy Savile shot to fame at BBC Radio 1 and in the hit BBC music show Top of the Pops. But it was his hit programme Jim'll Fix It, broadcast in the 60s and 70s, that propelled him on to becoming one of the most famous names on British TV and radio in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. Jim'll Fix It, which was very much family viewing, and children were encouraged to write in for Jim to fix it for them to live out a childhood dream. Sir Jimmy, as he became known after receiving a knighthood from the Queen in 1990 for his charity services, died a year ago, aged 84. Savile. Joining me on The Voice of Russia is Dr. John Bird, Operations Manager at the National Association of People Abused in Childhood. Abby Whittick, a journalist at Media Wales who once interviewed Jimmy Savile in the early 90s. And Ian Dunt, political journalist and editor of politics.co.uk. And Alan Collins, lawyer and partner at Panoni, specialising in compensation for child abuse victims. So what's the real story here? The covering up or the unearthing of a prolific paedophile? Ian, I'll start with you.
The latter. Really, the most important issue that we're dealing with is how rich, successful, especially celebrities in Britain, can get away with evading a level of scrutiny in this country, due mostly to their popularity, to the deference with which they're treated in the media, and to our libel laws. And because of that, they're able to get away with